Hello, I'm Jonathan Dimbleby. Thanks for taking the time to download this edition of Any Questions from BBC Radio 4. Welcome to Cheadle Hulme, which is just to the southwest of Stockport and not that far from Manchester Airport. We are the guests here of Cheadle Hulme School with some 1,500 pupils. It converted to academy status in 2012 and this year, for the second time in 3 years, has been awarded outstanding status. On our panel, Grant Shapps is chairman of the Conservative Party, and in that role, incidentally, amongst many other things, he's ruled out any pact or deal with UKIP after the next election. Lisa Nandy used to work for the homeless charity Centrepoint, then at the Children's Society, which focuses on the challenges facing young refugees. She entered Parliament at the last election to become one of the 6 Asian women in the House, where she is now Shadow Minister for the Cabinet Office. Molly Scott Cato was Professor of Strategy and Sustainability at Roehampton University before being elected as an MEP for the Green Party last May. Scott Fletcher is an entrepreneur and a winner of numerous business awards, including being named as the North West's Entrepreneur of the Year. He set up his IT company ANS from scratch at the age of 22 in 1996. It now serves thousands of clients with iCloud data and security services, has a staff of 200, a turnover of 50 million, and a profit margin of 10%. But by my bad mathematics, it makes about 5 million a year. Am I right?
It's on its way up. Should always be the case.
Did you expect to get that far when you started?
No. We were in a back bedroom in somewhere in Manchester, so absolutely not. I would have been happy with £100,000, I think.
OK. There's our panel. Could we please have our first question?
Hi, my name's Izzy, and my question is, in the light of recent claims by Stuart Rose and Stefano Pessina that Labour are anti-business, how would a Labour government benefit businesses?
How would a Labour government benefit businesses? I'll start with the Labour Party representative. How would you, Lisa Nandy, given what all the business community, or so many of the business community leaders are saying?
Well, I have to say, first of all, that as a local MP not very far from here in Wigan, I work very closely with small and large businesses in my community, and that's what the Labour Party has always done across the country. And, you know, the truth is that we're a party that was founded by working people for working people, and working people, by definition, need somewhere to work. So there is just no truth in the idea that Labour is anti-business. In fact, this country does best when the interests of business and the interests of working people are aligned. And in practice, what that means, I think, in 2015, is it means that we need more support for small businesses. We should cut business rates and give them a bit more of a fighting chance. We need to make sure that there is a well-supported, well-educated, well-treated workforce across the country, and that we should level the playing field for business and give them access to more opportunities, and that means being in Europe, at the heart of Europe, having an influence and an impact and being able to reform it.
Why, if you are so pro-business, why do you think that so many of your people who've supported you in the past are saying things like Sir Charles Dunstan, Car Warehouse, says he's frightened by the prospect of Labour. Assam Allen gave you 210,000, says a 50p tax will drive brains out of Britain. Have they not got it, or is Ed Miliband not getting it across?
Well, there'll always be business people with their own views. Some will support us and some won't. In fact, in the last few years, one of the most interesting things, I think, is that we've been able to draw on the talents of people in the business world, whether they support us or not. So we've had people who've run reviews for us into the infrastructure that's needed, into small business. Some of them are Labour supporters and voters, some of them aren't. And that's as it should be. Business people will always have their view, and sometimes they'll support us and sometimes they won't. Where we have differences, it's right that we should say so. But the truth is, the big priority for business in this election is about whether we stay in Europe, at the heart of Europe, changing it for the better. And on that, the only party that is guaranteed to deliver for business is the Labour Party.
Businessman Scott Fletcher.
Yeah. Well, I think when we hear from people in the Labour Party about things like rising tax and higher public sector spending, you just have to worry, do they really understand what is needed to get us through the next 5 years? And I think business people are really, they've lost confidence in the leadership of the Labour Party. And I think that is the truth. However, having said that, in the North West, the Labour Party has done brilliantly in getting investment in skills, getting a local city deal. So I think this isn't party politics. This is actually what's good for the UK, and we need to make sure that public sector spending is at a manageable level, not 50% of GDP, more like 40%, and it's maintained there. And we don't allow us to have an open chequebook and government officials make promises that they can't deliver on.
Do you share the anxiety or the more than anxiety of some of these business leaders who've spoken out and been rather sharply rebuked by Ed Miliband for so doing?
Well, I have a personal experience. I ran my business from the age of 22, and the Labour Party got rid of something called taper relief when they came into power, which meant that my tax rate for something that I'd built up over 20 years almost went from 10% to 40% overnight for something that I'd already done. So these are the things that I'm scared about as an entrepreneur, not just for me, but for the young people who are setting up businesses who are coming through now. We're trying to fly the flag for Manchester and the North to get technology businesses and startups, and we want this to really work. Now, if we're going to have young people worried about, well, I don't know what the landscape's going to look like. We need to have consistency of policy. We need to have consistency of real, true business ethics that will drive young people to start in business and deliver on the promises of our young people that we have.
Molly Scott Cato.
Well, from the Labour Party's point of view, I'm not so sure that these attacks are doing them a lot of harm, because the commentary at the moment seems to suggest that for Labour to win the election, they're going to have to actually move to the left and identify themselves more clearly with working people. And so these attacks by some of the leaders of big business, I'm not sure necessarily are harming them. But for me, I think the important point is that we're not talking about business as some kind of amorphous whole here. I think we need to distinguish between the small businesses that Lisa was mentioning and the big sort of corporate businesses where the attacks are coming from. And I mean, in my work in the European Parliament, I see, particularly in the case of tax avoidance, the power of big corporations to reduce their costs by avoiding paying their taxes, which means that the small businesses who actually create most of the jobs in this country simply can't compete. So, for example, if you run a coffee shop in the High Street in Stroud, where I live, you're having to compete with Starbucks, which can obviously charge less because it involves itself in some transfer pricing and therefore doesn't have to pay as much. And so the competition simply isn't fair. So I would like to see a situation where there was a level playing field for smaller businesses, and I would like to see an economy where we didn't see so much power from the corporations, and particularly the transnational corporations.
Grant Shapps, you were described by Ed Miliband as the chairman of a, not you personally, of a, quote, party of Mayfair hedge funds and Monaco tax avoiders.
Look, I mean, Ed Miliband's now very good at throwing these insults around at us or at business in general. But the truth of the matter is that 750,000 new businesses in this country over the last 5 years, and it's not happened by chance, it's happened because we've been pro-business, because we understand one simple truth. Without business, you don't get jobs. And it's a truth which has existed for a very long time, and there have been periods during which the Labour Party has seemed to understand this more, and periods where they haven't. But there's a simple fact that every single Labour government in history has ended up leaving unemployment higher. Why? Because rather than supporting business, cutting corporation tax, taking £2,000 off national insurance, making it easier to get into business by cutting thousands of rules and regulations, and therefore supporting jobs, and therefore creating wealth, and therefore being able to pay for the NHS and education, all those other services. Rather than doing that, Ed Miliband spends his time going around, insulting business, throwing up all sorts of barriers, and I think he would be an unmitigated disaster if he ever becomes Prime Minister of this country for business.
As a matter of fact, can I just clarify? Hedge funds are a butt like banks are, certainly for Ed Miliband. Do you have a view about hedge funds that is perfectly? You take a lot of money from them. You take 19 billion from about 27 of them as a party. Million. I said million. I think. Well, I meant to say million if I didn't. Sorry. Do you regard hedge funds as a making an important contribution to the economy, or as they're being described by Ed Miliband?
Which is, by the way, just to correct one thing, most of our funding, much more of our funding, also comes from ordinary members paying their membership, people from donating money in small amounts online and elsewhere, also in the region of millions. But look, hedge funds and everybody else in this country have to pay their way. We have introduced 26 separate measures to deal with aggressive tax avoidance, including several which mean that, for example, a boss of a hedge fund who under the previous government would pay less than their cleaner now doesn't, because we did something about capital gains tax. So we actually have quite a long record of making sure that people are having to pay and companies are having to pay their fair share. We've got a new tax that will come in which will prevent companies from showing zero profits and moving the money offshore, for example. But the simple fact of the matter is this: you can't create jobs unless you allow business to operate and flourish. And the fact that Ed Balls was unable to name a single business person apart from Bill somebody the other day on Newsnight is evidence, if you ever needed any, that actually Labour will be a disaster for business. They'll do what François Hollande's done in France, which is to drive business out. They've had more businesses go bust in the last 12 months than in history, and unemployment in France is pushing twice the rate of Britain. Is that what we really want? I don't think we do.
Lisa, can I pick you up on a point that was actually raised by Margaret Hodge today, who chairs the Public Accounts Committee, accusing PricewaterhouseCoopers of tax avoidance schemes on an industrial scale being sold, and then noting that a great many of the senior figures in the Labour Party, given Ed's view on hedge funds, it's interesting, are actually employing or have as on work experience or in pretty cheap terms employees of Price. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, I'm not going up against Margaret Hodge anytime soon. But I think there's no point in pretending that this is something that's an issue for one party or another. This is an issue for the country.
Yeah, but you can't get rid of the fact that it's an issue for you if it's for one party. Let me you say you won't go away with it. She said it's inappropriate.
Sure.
For instance, members. I mean, we know Ed Balls, Chukwuemeka have had a lot of money, both key business people from PricewaterhouseCoopers. Is that appropriate or inappropriate that you do that? She says, I wouldn't do it.
Well, the point is that if we get into government in May, we will do something about tax avoidance, and that is wherever you find it.
So
and
you're
whoever
happy?
it affects. I don't think, Jonathan, after the last week that we've had and the headlines that there have been and the attacks by the Conservative Party, I don't think that anyone can be in any doubt that Labour thinks that business should pay its taxes.
Yeah, but are you happy? Are you happy as a shadow minister that your colleagues who are shadow ministers are taking money from a company, a firm, which is openly accused of coming up with schemes to allow companies to avoid taxes?
No, well, look, the point is that we have to do something about the system. Yes. It's no use just going after individuals. You have to do something about the system. And it's what Molly just said a moment ago, is that at the moment we don't have a level playing field. So the small business in my constituency does pay its taxes, does play by the rules, and there are many other big businesses that do that as well. And there ought to be a level playing field. And that's wherever you find tax avoidance, we ought to be acting to stamp it out. This government really hasn't done anything about it at all.
Yeah. I mean,
apart from 26 separate measures that you could have taken at any time during the previous 13
Scott
years.
Fletcher.
Tax avoidance isn't illegal. We all avoid tax. We bring in green taxes to make people avoid those taxes, so we do different things. The bottom line is the system is broken. And the tax system, it has expanded from one small book to many, many books. So, of course, PricewaterhouseCoopers set up schemes to help people to avoid the tax and understand those laws. If we simplify the tax system, we get something a lot more easy to understand, and people will pay their taxes. I'm blooming sure about it.
I would just like to say,
apart from the bigger guy, OK, I'll take that. The bigger guys, we need to do it. But I'm talking about small business people, real people who have started businesses.
But
we will pay our taxes.
This is the point, that the big guys are actually setting the rules over taxes. They're doing negotiations with states, with Luxembourg, for example, in fact, with a lot of states across Europe. We've been working very hard in the European Parliament to get a full-scale inquiry into this. And I have to say that all the other big parties have not worked with us on that. And so, I mean, Grant may have made some small changes, but we're talking about €1 trillion that weren't paid in tax. Now, we're living in times of austerity where we're told we can't fund our public services properly. But the Commission, the European Commission, hardly some radical left-wing think tank has said that €1 trillion is not paid in tax every year. We have to stop this. And both these parties are just bickering now about who's going to deal with this. But we must, I think, as the public, make it clear that we will not accept this tax avoidance. And I think, it used to be acceptable to do drink driving. It used to be socially acceptable. We changed that. We have to similarly make it socially unacceptable to try to avoid paying your taxes, whether you're rich or whether you're a large business or whoever you are.
Any answers maybe for you after the Saturday broadcast of this programme? The number 03700 1. I'll say that again. I should know it by now. 03700 100 444. The line's open at 12:30. The email address any.answers@bbc.co.uk. In respect of both, Anita Anand will be there. Our next, please.
Hi, I'm Linda. What is the panel's view of the King's Fund verdict that the NHS reforms have wasted billions?
You follow this, Scott Fletcher. What do you think of it?
Yeah, well, ANS, my business has been working with the NHS since before inception. I was a consultant doing IT systems, and to be honest, it's horrendous. Every single new government that comes in changes the NHS. We've had FHSAs, PCGs, PCTs, you name it. There's always a different organisation to deal with, and I think we've got to settle with something and try and improve it, not by top-down reorganisation all the time, because all that happens is you're moving the chess pieces around. So I totally agree that what we're saying in the report.
Molly Scott Cato.
There are many reasons that the people in this country have lost faith in their politicians, but I think one of the worst aspects of it is a government saying, or rather before the election, the Conservatives saying clearly there will be no top-down reorganisation, and then immediately introducing such a thing. It is so dishonest and cynical that it really beggars belief. And not only that, when it's perfectly clear that it isn't what the people in this country want, that we really value a public health service where there's no profit motive involved, and to actually go to fly so totally in the face of what the people want so soon after you've promised to do the opposite, I think is just it just completely undermines people's faith in their politicians, and it really threatens democracy itself, I think. I think the King's Fund also said, and this is something where I'm now going to have a go at Labour as well, that actually the PFI deals were a part of what's gone wrong also in our health service. It's such an enormous waste of public money. The same report
told us
that...
Just to remind people the PFI deal.
This is where, instead of paying for a new hospital out of direct public investment, you organise a financial deal and then you rent the hospital premises back effectively. And the King's Fund said that we'd spent £63 billion on new hospitals because of the PFI deal, whereas they would have cost £11 billion through direct investment. So it's an absolutely shocking waste of money, and the Green Party is completely clear that the profit motive should play no role at all in the provision of health.
Chris Ham, the Chief Executive of the King's Fund, said the first 3 years of coalition government were wasted years because of the misguided focus on organisational changes that have only recently been compensated by this renewed emphasis on safety, quality and greater integration. Billions of pounds will have been wasted on those misguided reforms. By way of answering this question to start with, that's the verdict. Do you accept the verdict, Grant Shapps?
The King's Fund also said...
I'm going to
answer your question, but let me just point out what they said, because you've read one selective quote, and I just want to give you another part of their quote, which was that they said that public dissatisfaction with the NHS has reached an all-time low. In other words, people are more satisfied with the health service. So this was actually a much more balanced report than perhaps some of the comments have suggested.
Funnily enough, last week we discussed the NHS, as one does a lot, and that point was brought out very clearly by panellists. Come to Linda, if you don't want to answer my question, answer Linda Earnshaw. What's your view of the verdict that reforms have wasted billions?
No, I don't.
His words.
Okay, I don't agree, and the reason is this. Although the reforms obviously cost money to do in the first place, they're now saving £1.5 billion a year. And the reason why I point to the public level of satisfaction in the NHS, in the King's Fund report itself, is because the people that I'd really like to hear from are the people using the NHS, all of those of us who use it all the time, are the best people to judge the outcome. And just to clarify that, what we've done is to give the NHS over to the clinicians, to the doctors, to the nurses, to the experts who actually we would want running this organisation, rather than the politicians who used to run it. As a result, we've got 7,000 fewer managers managing the NHS, and instead, and I've got the numbers here, 9,000 more doctors, 5,000 more nurses, 2,000 more midwives. In other words, we're treating more people. It's now saving money every year, and as the King's Fund said, the focus is much more patient focused.
They also say, so just to finish, just for you say you want it more rounded, the NHS at the end of the Parliament is experiencing both financial pressures and challenges in hitting targets that matter to patients because time, effort and money that should have been spent on patient care has been diverted into complex organisational changes. You seem to be saying those complex organisational changes were 100% justified and you're glad they took place and Andrew Lansley did a great job.
Well,
is that the case?
I would take the view from the end of this Parliament, as I just said, we're treating a lot more people through the NHS, we've got a lot more doctors and nurses.
You're not saying you're saying that,
well,
but you're repeating that, and that's a mantra, as we well know, and it depends where your baseline is for the numbers you take.
2010 till today?
He says, I mean, that Jeremy Hunt is doing, is turning the thing round and it's much better. Do you accept the drive of what he's saying? You're saying, no, he's absolutely wrong, that Andrew Lansley was spot on, even though we didn't know about it before the election.
No one, I mean, the most ridiculous thing to do would be to say that look, everything that's happened over 5 years, absolutely perfect, no problems at all. With hindsight, of course, you do many different things. The point of this is that at the end of 5 years, we've got an NHS that we can be proud of, that's valued. And Simon Stevens, who's the chief exec of the NHS, has said that the 5-year forward view, the plan for the NHS, is the right way to go. And he's also pleased to say that the Conservatives are funding that, promising to fund that for the next 5 years and found the money going forward. We've had a real increase in the NHS budget of 12.7 billion, and Conservatives were the only ones who went into the last election promising to do that, a pledge that we kept.
What do you make of the King's Fund verdict, Lisa Nandy?
Well, I think, largely speaking, it's a disaster for the government, but much more important, it's a disaster, as it shows, for people who use the National Health Service. And Grant's right to say that we have an NHS that is worth valuing and supported. I wish that we could say the same about the politicians who are running it, because Jeremy Hunt and Andrew Lansley, until this afternoon, I thought were the only people who were still defending a £3 billion reorganisation that nobody asked for and nobody wanted. Now it appears that there's three of them. Grant is the third. And, you know, the truth is that this has destabilised the NHS, exactly as the King's Fund report said, at the very time when it needed to be stabilised and focused on patient safety. What we urgently need in the National Health Service is less pitting against one another in a competitive system and much more collaboration so that people can get the care they need when they need it. If you walk into any A&E department in this country at the moment, what you find is services stretched to breaking point. And the reason for that is that we underfund social care, we underfund primary care, so people struggle to get GP appointments, they struggle to get care in their own homes. There is a massive cost to the taxpayer around that, but there's also a human cost behind that we don't talk about very much. And if you want a really good example of where this marketisation of the NHS has been a disaster, you need to look no further than here in Stockport or in Wigan, where I'm an MP, and the outsourcing of patient transport to Arriva, undercutting the North West Ambulance Service. And what did that mean? It meant that patient dissatisfaction went through the floor and over half of people missed their hospital appointments. It's been a disaster. This mantra that private is best that we keep hearing from the government needs to stop and needs to stop now.
You say that. Can I just... I will tell you. You say that and you buy into what Chris Ham's report says. He also says about Labour that you are crying wolf, I quote him exactly, if you're arguing it's going to lead to the widespread privatisation of NHS care. Less than 10% of the healthcare budget was spent on non-NHS providers. Are you going to give up the privatisation charge in order to achieve a much better debate?
No, we've never said that we're opposed to the involvement of charities or even private companies in aspects of delivering health and social care.
You say they want to privatise it.
And that, you know,
do you think he wants to? Do you think Grant Shapps wants to privatise?
Well, that's what we've seen over the last few years. The health and social. If you just let me answer the question for a second, Jonathan. The Health and Social Care Act opens up the possibility of privatisation to any aspect of the National Health Services. And
So Ham's
the
right on
example of
something.
Aviva
Sorry,
shows you that there are times when that is completely inappropriate.
Forgive me, I want to stick
and
with Ham.
unnecessary.
You've praised Ham in age. You've said that what he says is a disaster for Tories. He says they opposed the bill, the proposals, for the reasons that Grant Shapps was asked to deal with. And then he said, you are crying wolf if you're arguing that the bill, is going to lead to widespread privatisation of the NHS. Do you accept that he's right when he says that? You don't seem to.
No, I have to say that respectfully I disagree with him, because actually if you read the report, although he does say once that it is crying wolf to suggest that this leads to privatisation, the report does underline the fact that what we've seen ever since that bill was passed was widespread marketisation and services being put out to tender that has not been in the best interests of either the National Health Service or patients.
There may be some listeners who think that you both cherry-pick those parts of Ham that you like and discard those that you don't. Grant Shapps.
Well, I just wanted to understand from Labour, Lisa, the policy, because you said we shouldn't have politicians involved in the NHS. The Act that we passed took politicians out, and someone called Simon Stevens now runs it as the chief executive. You want to undo that, in other words, bring politicians back in other words, have a reorganisation. I'm confused because what you've done in Wales, where Labour actually runs the NHS, has devastated the National Health Service there with much longer waiting lists and people crossing into England to get their help. And I'm also confused because for all your misguided accusations that we somehow want to privatise the NHS, is not true at all. You were the ones who ran all these PFI projects which have been criticised, and the only ever party to privatise a hospital in the NHS. So I'm confused where you're trying to go with this and whether, in fact, you're telling the whole truth.
Well, maybe I can help you understand, Grant. So, as the King's Fund report makes absolutely clear to everyone apart from you and two of your front-bench colleagues, putting clinicians and patients back in control of the NHS is not the problem. The problem is when you impose a top-down reorganisation.
But you're about to do that if you
several
undo
billion.
the
We
Care
absolutely
Act.
are not. We've said we will not do that, and we will knit the system back together in the interests of patients and in the interests of the people who use the National Health Service. But the truth is that the argument isn't about whether you put clinicians and patients back in control of the National Health Service. The argument is about who you do it and in whose interests. And what we've seen since your government came to power is services pitted against one another in a competitive system when they should be collaborating in the interests of patients, and we would stop that.
So this is a service that now gets far more patients through the system and spends £12.7 billion more.
I just wonder if you've been in an A&E recently,
which is an increase,
tried to get a GP appointment,
which is an increase,
or waited for an operation.
Everyone remembers the reason
Seems
that we're in this mess.
completely divorced from the
Lisa,
reality.
everyone remembers that the reason we're in this mess with A&Es is because of the GP contract that you guys signed in 2004 that stopped the GPs working in the evening and the weekend, something that we are reversing.
What
Molly Scott,
what these two are kindly
Mo-
proving is my original point that actually both of them, and the Liberal Democrats too, in fact all three of the Westminster parties, are implicated in the privatisation of the health service that none of us wanted, and that is completely undermining our faith in them. So that they may argue with each other about who was more responsible, but they both introduced the private principle into healthcare. In Labour's case, I think, we've seen recently John Hutton and Alan Milburn coming out and defending what they did, but we're deeply suspicious of the way that was done. There was definite hints of cronyism and personal enrichment, and that's undermined even further our confidence.
Sorry. Let's be very careful about what one says. I think you said something that you may not... if Sue Grab It and Run came for you, you may not wish to find yourself there in the court.
Certainly people who introduced policies that later they were able to join the boards of those companies.
Yeah, but it does not mean that they introduced the policies in order to enrich themselves.
OK, but certainly they made money out of the policies later, and I think that does raise questions about exactly what their motivations were.
We'll go to our next question, please.
Marie South, if you were to find yourself at the gates of heaven, what would you say to God?
Stephen Fry was asked that question. What would I come back to you straight away, Molly Scott Cato? You wouldn't say anything libelous, I'm sure.
No,
what would you say?
I won't be so rude now, definitely. Yes, I mean, I would try to imagine actually what God might be like, and I'd like to think it was certainly a woman, if it had any kind of physical form at all. And yeah, I don't know what I would ask. I was quite interested by Stephen Fry's question about why cause so much suffering, because I think it's kind of misunderstanding the complexity of life in a way that you would set up a simple system and everything would all turn out for good. So I don't think I'd be asking that, but I think I might raise some questions around how we might go about fulfilling our lives best on this earth. And yeah, I'd be quite interested to know the answer to that. But I personally don't believe that life is all full of sweeties and good things, and I think we also learn a lot from suffering. So yeah, I wouldn't agree with Stephen Fry about that.
Grant Shapps, what would you say?
You're really here. To which he might respond, you should be more surprised you're here, Grant. I literally... Thank you for your... Where would you even start if you came face to face with the Lord? It's a very, very difficult question to give a full enough answer to, but it's almost impossible this last week, having commemorated the 70th anniversary of Auschwitz being captured with a factory, I think the only factory, or series of factories in history, which was set up for the pure purpose of slaughtering people, making it somewhat unlike other genocides. My first question would be surrounding how that could ever happen.
Scott Fletcher, what would you say if you were to find yourself there?
I'd say hi, nice to meet you. Sorry, didn't go to church last Sunday.
When did you last go to church? He might ask.
It was actually yesterday for a funeral, unfortunately. But,
right,
yeah.
Dear, oh dear.
So, yeah, but it's like meeting Father Christmas, isn't it? I think I'm not a very religious person with that comment, obviously, but I would certainly try and make a deal at that point as an entrepreneur and try and find a win-win out of the situation.
Lisa.
Well, I think based on that, Molly is the only one who stands a chance of getting through the gates, for starters. So I would probably start by trying to ingratiate myself and apologising for being an atheist all my life. I might ask why he or she hadn't given us a few more clues as to their existence, and perhaps have a bit of a political discussion about that. I think the other thing that I might do, given that I am a politician and we agitate for change and that's what we're about, is I might give God a to-do list, or at least a revised to-do list. And I think I would probably start by saying, can you push poverty and tackling poverty in this country and around the world right up the political agenda? Because I think for anyone who's seen what the last few years have been like, and indeed longer than that for many of the poorest people in the world, you never ever forget what that's like, and I think that needs to be our number one priority as a society, but we could use a bit of help.
You put them in this precarious position. What would you, Mary South, if you were there, say to God?
I think I would be so overawed. I think I would initially be lost in wonder, love and praise, and I think I probably wouldn't say anything until I was spoken to.
Incidentally, Stephen Fry, just for those, well, one person left in the world who doesn't know what he said, why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world that's so full of injustice and pain? That's what I would say. It's been pointed out, we've had lots of tweets on this. Here's one from Alison Bancroft. It says, it wouldn't be God at the gates of heaven. She doesn't say for heaven's sake, but it wouldn't be God at the gates of heaven. St. Peter's the bouncer up there. Any answers on that or anything else? 03700 100 444. To our next, please.
Steve Brooks. Is the toxic management culture revealed at Rotherham Council an extreme example of a general lack of effective accountability in local government?
Can I just ask you, are you generally thinking it's that whatever there was there that's been unearthed, that there's, because of the character that's revealed about Rotherham by the reports, suggests that kind of thing or other not unrelated things could happen elsewhere? Is that what is underlying your question?
Maybe not related things, but certainly a culture of bullying and unaccountability at the top, yes.
Thank you. Lisa Nandy.
So what happened in Rotherham is not just horrendous, but I think is getting worse the more that we learn about what did happen, and the report that came out recently was terrible. There were members of the Labour Party who were implicated in that, and I think it's absolutely right that the Cabinet has resigned, that the Police and Crime Commissioner has gone, and that the councillors who were involved were suspended. And I wanted to say that because I think wherever you find this sort of thing happening, it must be stopped and the individuals must be held to account. But what I worry about in terms of accountability is that the story, at least of the last 15 years since I first started working with children and young people, some of whom were in similar positions to some of the young people in Rotherham, is that across the country, in different towns and cities, we've seen the same story. And you can go all the way back to the death of Victoria Columbier and read every serious case review, every report into what's happened. And what you find is that although individuals may be held accountable, that systems aren't challenged. And I would say, Jonathan, that the biggest problem that we have in this country actually is about the ability of children and young people to feel empowered and able to speak up, and about the willingness of all of us, services and the public, to listen to those concerns and to act on them. And one thing that we would do in May, if we win the general election, straight away, is that we would bring in sex and relationships education into schools. And we've had a really hard time about this in the media over the last week. But I would just say that having worked with children and young people in that position, an astonishingly high proportion of boys and girls in this country don't even understand basic concepts like consent or what a good, healthy, strong relationship looks like. And if we don't give them the tools to speak up, then in 10 years' time, you'll have another crop of politicians sitting on this panel saying we need to learn the lessons, and it's just not good enough.
Two things, please. Two things, if I may, just on that. Is it, as is being said, is it from the age of 5 that you would, in one way or another, begin the process of education about these matters?
Yes, so we think it's absolutely right that we should be talking with 5-year-olds about how to respect their friends and what a good, healthy relationship looks like, how to speak up when you feel uncomfortable if somebody's doing something that you don't like, and about things like stranger danger that I was taught about. These are all things that happen in some schools but not in others, and we think that's dreadful. The suggestion, though, that we would be teaching 5-year-olds about the intricacies of sex is just absolute nonsense, and more than nonsense, actually. I think it's utterly irresponsible when we've had so many of these cases around the country. And briefly, if you would, one other thing, the cabinet system, the cabinet within the council that Rotherham was, and obviously that's where the focus of the Casey report has been. That system was, I think, established by Labour. Is it something that needs to be looked at again as a structure which could bring about, to go back to our question, I said, similar things elsewhere? Yeah, I think there's a whole range of things that we should look like, and it goes back to the questioner's point about accountability. But what I would say is, having worked with social services over the years, I think there is a real issue about how we empower frontline social workers, because at the moment what we've got is a situation where individual social workers on the front line are accountable when things go wrong, but they're not empowered to make sure that they don't. And there's a real issue here, I think, about accountability that runs right from the very top of local authorities all the way down. And one of the things that we think needs to happen quite urgently is that we need to make sure that we bring back laws that Labour brought in after Victoria Columbier, so that all frontline professionals working with children have a duty to collaborate to keep children safe. They were removed under this government, but they need to be brought back.
Is Rotherham, do you think, Scott, an extreme example of a general lack of effective accountability in local government, as Steve Brooks asked?
Oh, it's a difficult subject, this one, isn't it? Because I think the politicians will avoid what is the root cause. I mean, we can talk about the local councillors and what they did wrong. We can talk about the people who work in social services and what they did wrong. But what actually happened in the community of Rotherham is what I'd like to know. What has changed in that town that has caused this to happen in the last, say, 10 years? And that's a really difficult subject that even I'm uncomfortable going into.
What are you uncomfortable about?
Well, we understand that these people are from Pakistani origin. So where does that take us, in that debate? I don't want to go there, I really don't, because I don't want to be the person on the panel taking us there. But, fundamentally, something's gone wrong in that community. something has gone terribly wrong. OK, these people haven't done their job right, and they should have been sacked, not resigned. And they should be, at the general election, we should elect new councillors, the whole lot of them. Yeah, so that should be given over to the people of Rotherham, and that should happen. We shouldn't be waiting another year or so. It should happen now, while it's in the press, while it's in people's minds. Let's have a proper debate and find out what happened over there and what is happening in other towns around the country as well. Because if what you say is right, we need to know. And you know, I fear for young people around the country, and I want it sorted as a member of the general public at the end of the day.
John Shapps.
So the Community Secretary, Eric Pickles, commissioned Louise Casey to do this report, which was the upshot of which is this week. And actually, when you read it, it literally brings tears to your eyes. It's one simple: vulnerable children being repeatedly failed by a council paralysed by complacency, institutionalised political correctness, and blatant failure of the political leadership, just exactly as Scott was saying. But the scale of this is incredible. 1,400 children subject to appalling abuse because there was a level of incompetence and political correctness which prevented them from getting into this. So the most immediate thing is Rotherham Council is going to have be appointed commissioners to run it. The reason there can't be immediate elections there is the whole council is so dysfunctional now that it literally needs to be taken by central government and run by commissioners for a year, and then after which point in 2016 there'll be elections to do exactly what you just talked about. But the other part of this, which hasn't been addressed, is the question of whether this extends to other councils or indeed other institutions or bodies or statutory institutions. And that is what we need to get to the bottom of, both historically and to know for today. And that's why we've set up this statutory inquiry led by Justice Lowell Goddard from New Zealand, from their High Court, who is now going to undertake an investigation which will have a statutory basis. That means, importantly, she will be able to require people to come and give evidence, and that is absolutely essential.
Given the scale of what has been, does her remit include in looking at or being able to look at all councils and the way in which they operate, if there is from that council or from that area allegations which are made to her? I mean, it's covering the whole nation.
Yes, so there are a number of different councils which have already been
they've been identified already. Yes, but if a whole lot of others came along,
oh yes, absolutely. No, this has got to be a proper, comprehensive, independent panel inquiry. And
this could last longer than Chilcot, couldn't it?
I don't think it needs to be a nothing can last longer than Chilcot. I hope that's not the case, and because she'll have the power to require witnesses to attend, to give evidence, and because it will be profession run, and because there's a need to get to the bottom of this, we shouldn't be living in a country where we just don't know the extent of it. Rotherham, things have clearly gone unbelievably wrong, and the details, when you read these two reports, one in August and one by Louise Casey, are just beyond horrendous. We need to get to the bottom of it, and that is what this appointment this week will do.
Maurice Scott Cato.
This is obviously a really terrible case, and I think what's most serious about it is the fact that we've failed some of the most vulnerable people in our communities, and in fact that there were significant pleas for help both from some of these girls themselves and from their families, and yet those pleas went unanswered. I think it's a serious failing of public services. It's a failing of the resources for social services within Rotherham Council, who were simply not able to do their job properly, I think partly because they were poorly resourced and poorly funded. I think the children's homes themselves... The children's homes themselves were not adequately funded. I mean, as Green Party policy, we suggest having much smaller, genuine homes for children who need to live in care. And I think, obviously, that's more expensive, but we think it's something that children deserve. So it's a failure of the funding of public services on the one hand, but I think it's also a failure of democracy. And I think that's where the questioner was approaching this from, really. Because we see a lot of areas where the Labour Party is so dominant that actually there is no real challenge to their authority. There's a couple of councils in London
Sorry
now.
to hurry you along.
Yeah, okay. There's a couple of councils in London now where they're all Labour councillors except for one Green. And as a response to that, we would suggest a different way of electing councillors locally that's more like the Scottish system. So you have a proportional system, so you're bound to get a spread of councillors from different parties. We think this is what's needed to improve democratic accountability.
Thank you very much. And I want to squeeze in, which sort of follows from this, squeeze in our last question, for which there's only a limited amount of time, very limited.
Andy Stoker, what are the marks of a good society?
The marks of a good society, only, I'm afraid, about 25 seconds each. Difficult. Lisa Nandy.
I would say that it's where we work together, look after one another, accept we have a responsibility to one another, and don't try and go it alone. It appalls me that in this country we have people waking up in the morning, stepping over people begging on the street in order to get to work, getting onto public transport that is staffed by underpaid workers who are struggling to make ends meet at the end of the week. That's not the sort of country I want to live in, and we could do so much better than this if we made different choices.
Go on, Shapps.
Well, I agree that the mark of a great society is one that cares for the most vulnerable people in society. So there have been some changes that have been made, for example, that people won't know about. If you see somebody who's rough sleeping, in this country, they now have a right to expect a hostel on the second night. And you can bring help to them by going to streetlink.org.uk. You can download the app, you can call the number, and you can bring them help. So a mark of a good society is one that cares passionately for people who are most in need.
Thank you. Molly Scott Cato.
Well, you're going to think I've been terribly influenced by my time in Brussels now, but I'm going to say liberty, equality, and rather than fraternity, I would expand that and go for solidarity. Those are the hallmarks of a good society, in my view.
And final word to Scott Fletcher.
And I would add to that freedom as well as liberty and social justice. You know, I've grown up in Manchester, it's a socialist area, and a living wage for people out there. You know, people deserve to have a living wage. And an economy where business can flourish.
Thank you very much. You've all been wonderfully helpful by being brief, which allows me to say that next week our panel will be the former leader of the Liberal Democrats, Ming Campbell, the Shadow Deputy Prime Minister, Harriet Harman, the former First Minister of Scotland, Alex Salmond, and Anna Soubry, who's Minister of State for Defence in this coalition government. Any answers for this programme you can still get 03700 100 444. Get in early, 12:30. Emails any.answers at bbc.co.uk and tweet #BBCAQ. That's all now we have time for. So from here in the Cheadle Hulme High School, Stockport, goodbye. I hope you enjoyed Any Questions this week. To find out more about the programme or how you can get us to come to your area, then go to the BBC Radio 4 website and search for Any Questions.